All right. I mean, the stories of the two are interconnected. When we talk about Rwanda and Burundi and the regions and its proximity there, it's right near the sort of eastern border. It's the mid east, central east border of Congo. Right there is Rwanda, as you saw on the map. We'll look at this more so. But it's connected there, but culturally, from a distinct sort of a sort of a experience, right? This manifestly distinct. The Great Lakes region, a dynamic culture. I think this is one of these places where I think the real sort of truths of the cultural history here are just beginning to be sort of unpacked, and it's amidst war and other things. So, but I think there's quite a bit here to know, right? I mean, we're talking about some of the earliest places of human development here, right? In this region here, right? Or the earliest of humanity. Let me say it that way. That's a better way to put it. Earliest humanity, right? So interesting stuff there. But you really got three sort of groups in what is called this Great Lakes region, and we'll look at it on the map. You'll see why it's garnered this name, right? The Tutsi folk, the Hutu folks, and the Twa people, right? Now, the narrative the Belgians tell is that the Tutsi people are these sort of special folks who were connected through, of all things, the Hamitic curse, right? Remember we talked about that way back in the game. I made mention of it. Some of you have had me other classmates heard me make reference to the Ham's curse. We'll talk about it if folks want to be clear about what it is. How is Ham's curse going to play in all this? Well, remember what it said, right? About people, right? That all those who had been, part of the son of Ham, of Noah, of the descendants of the African race, essentially, were all cursed. But there were varying degrees of the curse. I mean, and what, of all things, color becomes a feature of the variant. So do other things as problematically characterized as phrenology and this other foolishness that becomes a hallmark of science of maybe the 17th, 18th, and 19th century, right? The sort of pseudo silly science stuff. But that sort of narrative, that sort of history, that way that the Belgians, when they come in contact with these people, when they get here, right? And actually, it's the Germans and then the Belgians, we should say, because the Germans are here first. When they first arrived, that's the first thing they start doing. They start looking at these folks talking about, oh, you got a whole kind of thing going on, right? This Hamitic piece is at work, right? And this is how we can classify these peoples. And it was messy because really it didn't. First of all, it made absolutely no sense because it had no connection to the reality of what was going on and the ethno-cultural history of the region you know. And in fact, the Twa, who are actually, we would call them maybe the little people today, right? People sort of pejoratively use that term pygmy, which is a considered negative and rightfully so pejorative term, or bushman, which is sort of equally problematic. Hottentot is another. You get these sort of problematic labels, and then none of them are good. Twa people, the Twa is a nice one because that's what they are. And they're the little people in the forest. So you have folks who are perfectly human in every way, but their stature is just maybe an adult male grows to maybe about just under 5 feet. That's the tallest. So it's a very interesting kind of a thing, right? And if I link it to cosmology, it's very, very interesting because all throughout West Africa and many of the discussions of finding or being trained or taught how to engage with the spirit world, how to engage with plants and animals in the deep parts of the forest. They go in there and they say, yo, I bumped into some small person in the forest. And they took me and showed me everything I need to know. And it's funny because these are folks who really did that live very deep in the forest. And it evokes some very interesting questions around some of these cosmologies of folks way, way far away who, always reference, small people in their sort of spiritual experience. I mean, some of it obviously can be brought on by other kinds of things too. I mean, but all right, anyways. So you got the Twa people, you got the Tutsi who are the clan folks. They're the ones that, and essentially they become presumed to be more powerful because they operate with pastoral clans, right? So they got animals, right? But that's counter to the Hutu, right? Who have been farmers historically. Now there have in history there was some interface. Not everybody who was a Hutu was a farmer, and not everyone who was a Tutsi was a pastoral clan. There was some intermingling going on. Same thing with the Twa people. There's some interface here, right? Or coexistence, some tension, but essentially coexistence, right? On this land, this beautiful land, the Great Lakes region, beautiful. And but in all classes, in all I mean, I'm sorry, in all societies, I mean, this might be an element of human nature, perhaps. You see systems of power begin to emerge. That's just how it works. I mean, and land becomes the sort of a currency. So you do have a Tutsi elite, and they do see themselves as these sort of Mwami or god kings, right? And you know, people blood does play in membership in this Tutsi elite for sure. Mwami, you can't just be the bottom of the earth Hutu farmer or member of a Twa clan, perhaps to be considered eligible to be a member of this Tutsi elite. But believe me, there's some Hutus up in there. You can bet your money on that. Maybe not a lot, but there's some. And the ancestral connections, if people only started to go back and start looking, they would inevitably find that, you know, well, yeah, we probably are actually a little bit more closer to Philly than we actually thought we were, right? But a narrative of separatism has been already, a seed had been planted, right? And it's a nasty one, right? So as the Germans come, they come with the sort of system of indirect rule, right? And so they use the Mwami as their sort of mouthpiece to tell the locals what to do. You can imagine too, this is going to build into a tension, right? And because the Mwami are considered to be less impacted by the Hamitic curse or more elite, and they deal more directly with them, and sort of the Hutu and the lesser the Twa, you could see something beginning to happen already, right? And then World War One comes along, and the Germans lose that colony, and it becomes under the control of the Belgians. It becomes a trusteeship by the League of Nations mandate. And if you know anything about the League, you know the League didn't have no daggone teeth to do nothing anyway. It wasn't going to do nothing anyway. 1,013, 14 points. Woodrow Wilson's for, all right, I'll behave. But you all know that the League of Nations was like rotten as touchwood when it came to implementation and having strength in terms of policy. What happened with them in Ethiopia? All right. Anyways, so they weren't very strong. So they weren't going to do much to help to ensure that the Belgians were going to act and behave in a way that was viable. Look what they were doing in the Congo at the time. And that's part of the reason why it becomes their trusteeship, because they had already had this sort of large footprint in the region as a Western authority and someone who could exert power in the region over resources, at that point, rubber. So then you can see how they would operationalize regional ethnicities and make them sort of make a case for racializing people, right? Um, by a dynamic we've talked about. From the same German ethnographers who idealized some of the early notions of separate notions of Nazist ideology are some of these same writers and readers and thinkers and ethnographers who are drawing out this evidence in the context of their exposure to Africans via their colonial system, right? But when they go, the Germans keep it in place and even build on it, right? And I don't want to step off into a German conversation here, but it is worth noting Germany in the context of this and in the context of Africa. Just as with Belgium, I think it's relevant to take a look at Germany at home a bit. Let's do this just a bit here. This is part of our revisionist dynamic, by the way, home and abroad, if you haven't picked that up already. 1870, they had just sort of wrestled through a pretty fierce war, the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. They essentially are able to show real strength, right? And fearsome power throughout Europe and begin to establish themselves, right? They take two states, Alsace and Lorraine, right? And then that in the wake of these events is the establishment of the Third Republic. It leads to another coup, right? The Third First Republic. Remember, we're saying France went through several coups throughout the 19th century, and late 19th, late 18th, early, into the 19th century. That's not early. 1870 not that early, is it? But for Germany, it's going to establish a German empire, and France ultimately will pay 1 billion francs in war debt. Right? They're going to have to pay not only will they lose territory, they have to pay, and Germany's going to occupy the region. What do you think the French and the English are going to do to the Germans after the end of World War One when the Germans lose? Did they forget about this? No, they didn't. Right. Now, why am I bringing all this up? Right? Because I know I could hear maybe rumblings as you watch this of a "who cares" moment. This has nothing to do with Africa, kind of a thing, and you might be right. Um, there are tensions with all this. There are tensions at home, and that's why that sort of counts, right? Um, and again, people will use the premise of nationalism and war. We're going in a glorious mission to Africa to go forth and to do and to conquer and to civilize. We're on our way to what is Rwanda? It had another name. There's a name for the region, and I'll be able to provide it when we're in class. But they had the name for the region, Burunda, Rwanda, Burundi together. Might have been Burundi or so. I forgot what it's called there. But you know, hey, this is our new land. We got to go here and subdue the local people and spread our belief system, the Hamitic myth. No, let me stop. But and go over here and do all this stuff. There are aspects of German colonialism. We'll get into it momentarily here, so let me not jump ahead of myself. But that silences the critics. And everybody's on board with all this. I mean, there are voices in Europe that are critical. I mean, and that's why I think the voice of the white man's burden is so important, because Rudyard Kipling, as a white person, I mean, in Europe, as he writes it to make fun of America and what America's doing in the Philippines, which was a part of this sort of Cuba and then the Philippines, right? Kind of a thing. Our war, 1890s war, 1898 war, yeah, 1898 war with Cuba, right? And then right after that, we're in the Philippines, right? And what did we say we were doing there? We talked about we were going there to civilize. A lot of the things we used to justify in Cuba was civilizing of it, right? And then remember when the ship blows up there in the harbor, right in the midst of the wake of the war, which we later found out was actually caused by just an internal combustion. There, nobody did anything, but that became our precursor to go fight, right? And then we launched the whole war against Spain, because our own ship blew up because of our own mistake. But a war was certainly launched, and the reason why we did it was we said we were going to go rescue those French, those Caribbean or Cuban people from the horror of these mean Spanish. The Spanish are so mean; they're tearing these people up. We got to go rescue these poor people, right? And how did America rescue Cuba? Okay, well that's a whole nother story that get you to Castro, but not in a nice way, right? And so you got some real tension there, right? But in many ways, there were folks who they were critical of it. They didn't accept these ideas. They didn't think that it made sense for countries to walk into another country and say essentially we're taking everything, and no matter how you describe it. That's why Rudyard Kipling's making fun of it. Talking about it's a white man, it ain't so no damn white man's burden, man. But it's funny. He's poking fun. He's saying, look at these people who are saying that they have a burden to go out here and civilize people, but what they're really doing is very uncivilized, and they're being very murderous in that process, right? That's a voice that maybe people wouldn't hear today, and they wouldn't understand the satire. They would read straight into it, and get so angry and say, "Look, this is this, and this." But I hope people would slow down and catch the meaning there, and understand that sort of use of satire. I hope we still have a place for that, because essentially it was very important, right? But Bismarck wasn't at all sort of 100% gassed up on Africa until he realized that he could use it to calm France down. I mean, that's the short of it. And I've looked at some texts on this issue. I could recommend some if you really wanted to remind me in class. There's some that you could read that really sort of spell some of this out. But I mean, at its heart, it's that issue of maybe saying to France, okay, after a war we fought, and your loss of territory, France can kind of go first in Africa, and since Germany was less interested but did have some interest, into the game, they will go in this sort of way. And pretty soon that's going to grow. That interest grows, right? And with the Berlin Conference, right? And the sort of agreement for folks to sort of freely navigate the region, right? Um, you got a green light. People can get in here and machinate and do what they like to do, right? And so Germany spreads out, right, into a couple places, right? Togo. Remember, this is where some of the first shots of the war are fired, and then also in Southwest Africa, Namibia, and then in the Cameroon, right? And then on the east side, the Pacific claims, right, to territories, right? A lot of that was done very strategically, right, to annoy Britain, appease France, and placate expansionist-minded groups at home, because many folks were talking loudly about, you know what, this is not viable for a nation who's in its own route challenged, right? We're dealing with our own challenges. We just, the Franco-Prussian War, the decades leading up to some of the tensions that will bring us to World War One. We already talked about some of the interconnectedness of some of this in some very interesting ways, right? I mean, there are many voices who are sort of critical of this. I mean, people are critical readers throughout the world and have questions and critique and can look at this and say, no, this is not right, you know. But then, it's hard against those voices, against loud other voices to say, well, this is our national right, right? It's hard to quiet that voice, right? When you could grab nationalism and champion that as the cause or the reason for why you have to do what you do. It's hard to silence that voice. Um, and so it's working, but what Germany is doing in these places is some pretty bad stuff. I mean, Krassen terrorism and substance Grossamkeit. I can never say the last part right, but you know what that one means, right? With extreme terrorism and power, with extreme power and vengeance, with might, essentially, right? Um, and that was essentially the sort of, you know, um, that's the approach, man. Is to go there and pound people into place, and then after that, use maybe more benevolent ways, right? Uncompromising and decisive enrichment of German peoples at the expense of weaker peoples, right? And plantations economy set up in these German places prior to World War One, based on, okay, we seized the land, so you come in, pound everybody into a point of sort of acquiescence, right? And then you start turning a corner, right? For instance, what you see in places in the Cameroon, which was another of their colonies, right? Remember, these are all the German colonies. They do something. Bernard Dernberg, Google that name if you want. You'll see he's on all over the map there with this sort of terminology of scientific colonialism, right? But this becomes a very early sort of precursor to some of the sort of Taylorism and other kinds of concepts. The sort of assembly line, this is a feature of this utilitarian and management techniques, right? From those sort of systems of industrialization, sort of applying those to colonialist processes, organizing processes. And you got, of course, the best ideas of creating and organizing industrial systems for commoditization and to improve wealth and improve outcome and profit, I mean, will be applied to colonialism, right? So the violence gets used somewhat strategically, but when it's used, boy, is it used, you know? And so now you come in with a system that maybe is more viable, right? Um, but the prior systems have been the feature of it, right? Preservation with the missionary, doctor, railway, and machine, theoretical and applied science, right? So this is how you keep everything in. Now you help out, you show people the benefits of maybe some of this, and you also too allow people to experience some of those benefits, right? So there goes Germany on the at the very after engaging in such violence at the end, trying to turn the corner with an approach that works a little bit better, right? One that works a little bit better. And but maybe it's too little, too late. And on top of that, the prior histories of violence and other things just don't make for something that's viable, right? By World War One, Germany's going to lose all her territories in Africa at the end of World War One. So that's going to change things. Belgium's going to take some. The British take some. The French take some. Everybody takes up, what's left over, right? And but something here that is a consistent sort of feature is not going to play, because now when we start to turn to Rwanda here, but we have to remember it just in general, and that's the sort of notion of rivalry, right? Uh, and this is the lens which, working with an African sort of researcher that I mean, I was invited to sort of really sort of make sense of this conflict was through the lens of rivalry, competitive struggle between two or more state actors over variable stakes, right? Rivalry, and as not just as a sort of definition of rival, but more as a political term, rivalry, right? And the history of the sort of tensions of political actors and rivalry in that context, right? And so an African has sort of set up this paradigm to sort of advance an understanding of the tension that will play out between the Hutu and the Tutsi folks, right? And amidst the tension between the shift between the end of the German colonies and the arrival of the Belgians, and now we're talking about Rwanda particularly, right? And then other things like the Bahutu rebellion or revolution in 1957, and in the 1994 genocide. We could also sort of mention independence there too. There will be features of this tension, right? Uh, uh, um, but even before we even sort of get really to this sort of specifics of this, I just want to sort of again bring us to some reminders of some of the positives of you know the resistance, the forms of resistance, and the ways in which people are responding to and resisting this, right? And one example is this is the Mai Mahi rebellion, right? So amidst the use of these sort of new terms, this sort of Bernard scientific colonialism, right? Of using these sort of forced labor techniques and growing technique, right? You have people who start to sort of organize around resistance to this in its entirety, and they believe that they have this sort of holy water, the Mahi water that gives them resistance and immunity to bullets. It's not a new thing in Africa for people to believe in this kind of thing. Not in East Africa, not in West Africa, not in North Africa. Find notions of invincibility by these things in all kinds of beliefs and cultures, right? So it is you, and but to organize it politically, right? Here you go, talking about using traditional spiritual belief and other forms of sort of resistances in a way to organize what unity, commitment, and also to fight, right, against the Germans, right? And it was a lot of fighting because they never really backed down. And the Germans had to get to some really sort of very ugly tactics to end, right? Burning people out so you destroy their ability to eat and continue sort of military resist action, right? And ultimately, the German state's going to be there, but again, very quickly, the game will turn because they're going to lose it after the end of World War One. But yeah, and even in those moments, though, due to the scientific system, this is what I'm saying. It complicates this because I'm readily critical of what Germany does, and that one's not going to change. I don't the Netherlands, the France, or whoever. Because when I can look over here and see what has happened in Africa in these instances, it's problematic stuff, right? But I have to sort of see something here too, right? That Germany, in the midst of this, at least compared to the other folks, tries to build roads, schools, research institutions, and churches. What's the long term impact of that? I think that's where the rubber hits the road. I think that requires some more critical question and investigation, right? Because their footprint was shorter because they were gone by they were gone by 1919. Treaty of Versailles, Germany was out, right? And so that did sort of it froze things. And even though Belgium comes in, France comes in, Germany comes in, these other things, infrastructurally, some things have been laid. So this is an interesting thing to consider, right? In the context of things, right? And also too, I would just add, like I mean, some groups will try to rectify some of this and try to make efforts, acknowledge the reality of this, not in a sort of paternal way. What does that mean? Like I've seen NGOs do a way that look positive and congruence with local folks. They come and say in a essential way, what can we help? How can we help? And people say, well, you know what? Build the road from here to here. Now the good stewards, and I've seen them, some coming from Europe, some coming from the United States, say, okay, you know what we're gonna do? We're gonna build a road and we're gonna go. We're out. And I've seen them come and do that. Come in and you catch the guys coming and they're finishing the road. Well, what was you doing over here? Oh, nothing. We came, we built the road. We're going home, right? And but the other ones, you already know how it gets nasty because people say, well, the road will be conditional, and then if we do it, then this kind of thing. But that's the right kind of thing to be thinking on. So I just say that that has been a counterpoint to some of this, right? But the stench of violence is still just that's the piece. right? And it isn't, and it didn't sort of die down. I mean, Germany just wasn't sort of the feature of it, you know. Um, but other things there too that and are part of what we have to take away from what this genesis of German influence in Africa is going to bring with it, right? On other groups. Another example of folks who we just did with the Herero and the Nama people, and these are people over here, maybe on the sort of on the southwest Germany, right, or southwest Africa. The Kalahari Desert, that region down there. So it's dry desert down there. And people live very much in the sort of subsistence farming way, and sometimes very, very much in these sort of mobile communities as well. So, undermine the local sort of system and local the ability of local agriculture to provide for folks in any way is going to kill people, right? And the Germans put some of those tactics, scorched earth and other kinds of means in place, right? The attacking of unarmed villages, right? You can see something that will reduce a population from 80 to 15,000 people, right? Um, and what they will use, the way they will sort of operate, is in something that's akin to indentured servitude and slavery, right? And then you have these folks here. I mean, you got Bernard and scientific colonialism, and then you have Eugene Fisher and genetic research on these sort of Eurocentric ideas in the 20th century, right? This could be very influential to some of the things that you'll see that will play out in Europe as well. So it's fishy. It's a fishy mess, and hasn't been entirely sorted out. I mean, and I don't mean in terms of the fact that what horror was brought here by the colonial system and the horror that the Germans would bring. I don't. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm not. There's no question of that. What I mean is the sorting out of the truth of this, which is tough to have that conversation. That's the one that we still need to have. Because and the reason we don't have it is because it will lead us to down a very, 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 very problematic road, right? And as I mentioned something about Germany, the War One, just that connection, right? I mentioned before that the first shots were fired in Togo, and some of the last fighting takes place in East Africa. And the commander is Paul von Lettow Vorbeck. Um, and he's using an army with guerrilla tactics. He has local people fighting with him. They even give him this name. I forget what it's called, but they become very, very sort of known as these serious soldiers, right? They're very, very effective fighters, right? But they also use these porters in a very, very problematic way as well, right? But the only reason he ends and the only reason things end because he was still fighting is because what happens at home, or in Europe, I should say, when events in Europe end, the Americans, for one thing, enter the war. When that happens and the war ends in 1919, then there's no longer a need to fight. That's why he stops fighting. He is never defeated in Africa, right? This kind of thing with this sort of pretty strong army he's using to sort of which included, yes, military fighters who were African, but also too included a large numbers of Africans who were used as these sort of conscripted porters. And these are just people essentially you just carry stuff around. Yes, desertion and leaving and breaking ranks and also disease and other things were endemic for sure. So some of my sort of desire and sort of walking us through some of this German stuff, Bernard Dernberg's scientific colonialism, Paul von Lettow, Vorbeck in the end of World War One, and these kinds of things. I mean, I'm trying, and even the efforts by Germany generally to sort of use very, very violent means of tactics, right? I mean, all this it's softening up the place. I mean, locally for I think some of what will come, right? We already talked about some of those tensions, right? Those leftover legacies. So when these colonial folks have to go, either because of issues at home or because of sort of the independence movement, which is taking root throughout the continent, what have you, they leave sometimes in very much a wake of, a lot of chaos in their wake. Essentially, let's just say it like that, right? So you have a Hutu majority, and then you have a Tutsi minority. Remember, these are the Tutsi who have been known as the sort of quote unquote collaborators. And essentially, the Germans did reach out to them, as we described, more than they would the Hutu, right? And so then the Tutsi, of course, they took advantage of that, unfortunately, in a very, very negative way, right? And then there was some reform, some push for reform after 1952, but that not enough, right? Something that really hinted that things were going to get ugly, and which really should have gave everyone pause, but did not, was 1957. Everybody talks about other dates as a precursor to this, particularly after independence when there's real show reprisals in 62. And that's bad too. But from my own research and discussions with folks, the Hutu Manifesto was the one, because that was the one where the Hutu nationalism, and they articulate one, it is one based on the disenfranchisement of the Tutsi. And nobody thought much of it. Nobody thought much of it. I think essentially, a lot of the thinking must have been around. You know what? Um, this is a nationalist ideology, and we are, the misperception of the sort of African states and their push towards nationalism was there as it was. But I don't want to quantify it. People just did. People knew. Some folks did know, but they just didn't pay. They just didn't make the world know before it was too late. Because in the manifesto, when they started to tell people very clearly there that we are no longer going to allow these people to rule over us, and then they start to use terms of hate and violence in terms of their description of the people, right? I mean, this is just a bad. It's a very clear sign. It's to lead up to some things, right? 59, there's revolt, and then there's real talk of sort of consensus action, right? That leads to a Hutu provisional government, and but the tension is already there. So at independence in 1962, you got the Tutsis, right? Kings, Mwami kings, the monarchists, the progressives, those who want to work with the Hutu, and the activists, maybe those who say, you know what, we got to protect our interests. So you got maybe three groups generalizing, right? Who get displaced, right? And in 62, after independence, um, you know, some 20,000 people are massacred. And those three groups that we described there are all become mobile, have to get up and move around, get out, you got to go, right? The Tutsi fight back, right? But when they do, the Hutu kick back too. And now, they seem to have they have a better representative in government because they make up the majority of the population, the presumed majority of the population. Uh, that's it. And see, that's the thing. When the nationalism was one that was essentially said, 1962, when we gain our independence, we're gonna take care of and destroy the Tutsi people. So, like, think of that as a way to form a state, and you sort of see what the outcome is gonna be, right? Um, and in 1990, a Tutsi leader who's going to play a role, who's still around to this day, Paul Kagame, will come back with the Tutsi to invade the RPF, which is still, again, I think, around to this front, the Royal Patriotic Front, if I believe that's what it's called, right? They invade Rwanda, say, okay, you know what? You got to do this right. You got to have multi-party elections. And I'm sure, and this time Kagame comes with a little bit of strength. He's got enough strength and authority to force the hand of the government to at least have to sit at the table to work with them, right? But the multi-party elections lead to the election of a president, Hibrahima, who actually had promised to, in accordance with Kagame and others, um, build a more equitable system, right? The Tutsi were going to be checked some, I believe, but the Hutu reprisal and violence just had to stop, and we had to have a better system. We can't form a constitution on the annihilation of our peoples, right? And where are the Twa and all of this, the small folks? They're in the forest, man. Most of them are like ghosts. A lot of them are ghosts. I ain't mad at you. I would have, they probably saw this, what was coming. They could probably see what was coming, right? You notice how they sort of, although they're one of the third sort of minority groups here, and they still feature in the reprisals and in the violences, right? And in some ways, they're not as much a feature as the Hutu and the Tutsi are, as these definitions and identities, right? That says something there. But this new president and his promise to do everything, is dramatically depicted in this film sometime in April. And as April 6th, he fires his hand shoulder missile, knocks down the plane, and then for the 100 days thereafter, you just see what has been sort of brutally played out, so frequently in so many other instances. This killing of some 1 million people, Tutsi, and any of their Hutu collaborators, right? and it's been so dramatically depicted. Sometimes in April is a strong one. I know many folks, have seen the Hotel Rwanda, these things. There's another film too, this thing on Netflix, and we'll take a look at it in class to maybe sort of unpack some of this also to get at these legacies, and we'll discuss it a bit further in class. All right, so that's that. Thanks.